the javelin catcher during Dubai Ports on the Hill. And basically, in this town, when there's a controversial transaction, senior officials run. And Clay stood up. And I have enormous respect for the way you handled that and your skill and grace. Second thing is Clay was, on a personal note, very ill a couple of years ago, last year, and the entire town, the entire trade community came together to support him. So we're glad you're healthy and back with vigor. Nancy McClernand runs a great organization. We've known each other for many years, and the thing about Nancy and Offie is that it's a small organization, but they punch above their weight. They have enormous influence on an important issue of inbound investment. They're very, very effective, and Nancy's done a great job there for how many years have you been there?
30.
She's just getting started. And Chris has a distinguished background in policy and senior government roles, worked on basically a lot of the controversial issues that Trump is criticizing today, so congratulations. But the thing about Chris, on the FIRMA debate, he had enormous conviction and a strong point of view and took really a load of criticism from various parts of the Hill, which in many respects was unfair. And I just want to say that I admire the way you stood your ground, you articulated a view, and you took a bunch of incoming, and you had a very significant impact on the legislation. So thank you for what you did. So Clay has been, each of them are been assigned 5 to 7 minutes. Clay will talk for about 45, and then I'll ask some questions. So Clay.
Thanks, David. Thanks for the remarks. It was you and many others did reach out to me last year. So I had this weird disease called Guillain-Barré syndrome, which actually paralyzed me. And so, and then I went through all this rehabilitation. And the first week I got back from this, I was like, gosh, I just need something else, like some other pain. And so what did I do? I went and testified on CFIUS. That was a mistake. Okay. I thought Heath Harvard did a pretty good job of explaining where did this come from, FIRMA, and how we got there, and also some of the debates that were, especially during the Q&A session. So I thought that I'd talk a little bit about the process to get this legislation to become a reality, partially because of my own experience from 11 years ago. And he kind of put this in there. There's a short term, there's a medium indeterminate term, which is the pilot projects, and then a long term, which is the rulemaking regulations, because that's obviously what most people are going to have to focus on. As a very rough guide, I led this process 11 years ago when, despite what Heath just said, it was pretty significant changes that we had to go through, but it was nothing compared to what these guys are about to have to go through. From the time the legislation passed until we got the regulations done, through the review and comment period and so forth, it took us 18 months. Now, against us, this was led by the Treasury Department, and it was during the greatest financial crisis since the Great Depression, so that is a factor that we had to take into account. It did kind of pull resources. But I think that it is going to be a tougher row to hoe than Assistant Secretary Tarver just laid out. Dave started getting at this in his questioning, which is when we were going through it, some of the toughest issue was trying to figure out what is the definition of control. That had never been actually really well defined in the original the original regulations that had been put out about 25 years ago. So we had to try to go through that. Now, the worst part about it was not dealing with the public and through the review and comment period, and we got great comments that actually did affect what we did. It was going through the interagency process. So Treasury took the lead draft, but we had to make sure we had the Defense Department on board, We had to make sure we had the Justice Department on board. Good luck on that because they happen to be a bunch of lawyers. We had to go through the U.S. Trade Representative. Good luck on that because they love to negotiate little tiddly things that are in trade negotiations. And then we had to go through the Department of Homeland Security, and I can't even describe that. And then finally, you had to get the White House to sign off. And so you're trying to do this. It takes time. It's difficult. And so I think the next 18 months, you will see some of these difficulties, or at least maybe you won't see these difficulties, but that's what's going to happen. So let's go through a little bit about what I think are some of the key elements. So in the short term, the key elements for those especially that are filers of CFIUS legislation, there's some little changes that are actually kind of important. One is they've changed the timelines, as Heath talked about. Where you'll have, instead of 30 days, followed by 45 days, followed by the indefinite withdrawal and refile, withdrawal and refile, withdrawal and refile if it's a difficult case. Now it's going to be 45 days, followed by another 45 days, and then they're going to put some rules around this, but basically say you can't continue to do these constant refilings. I think that's a positive thing both for the government and for the filers to just kind of know that this is the way it's going to have to work going forward. Secondly, also another positive thing, in my opinion, is the exchange of information with other countries. This is something that was not really allowed under CFIUS, and so now they will be able to do this. As Heath talked about, other countries are working on their versions of investment review mechanisms. I'm not going to say their versions of CFIUS because CFIUS has lots of flaws, so hopefully not everybody copies us. But information exchanging between allies, I think, is going to be a very positive thing. I'll skip for a second pilot projects and move instead to what I think is the tougher issues, which are the final rulemaking. So key issues to keep in mind. Most positive thing in here, it'll take a while to go through the rulemaking on this. Most positive thing is they've taken away CFIUS's ability to stall. So if you're an investor, this is the most positive thing. So right now, CFIUS, the way it works is you do a filing. CFIUS does not have to accept that filing. It doesn't have to accept it for 3 days, 3 months, 3 years if it wanted to. Obviously, they don't do that, but it does take a while. If you talk to the CFIUS bar, they would tell you over the last few years, it's gone up to being like, when we were running it, our kind of internal rule was 72 hours. 72 hours you had to accept the filing or reject it. Now it's taking over a month to do this. So that extends your timelines significantly. In the legislation, it is now going to be a 10-day process. You have 10 days to figure this out. CFIUS can either accept it or not accept it. And obviously, part of this will be on the, he talked about the declarations. You'll have the 5-page declarations. That's another way of trying to at least create a speedy process. And the reason is because the 200 transactions that he talked about, which is overwhelming the system, is going to jump to roughly 1,000 transactions, if not more than that, because of the way it's done. The tougher issues are going to be kind of coming up with definitions. What is the definition exactly of critical infrastructure, critical technology, sensitive personal data? I actually thought I heard the reporter's question earlier about the Hill letter. I thought that the Hill letter was kind of helpful in that front, in that it basically said, you know, it's supposed to be linked to national security. It's not supposed to be everything. And so those are issues that CFIUS is going to have to rely on and worry about what the Hill thinks, because the Hill has already spoken on this. The 5-page declaration is, I think, a good thing. We'll see how it works in practice. They're going to have to figure out, how do I get the information I need, being CFIUS, to figure out whether or not the case can go through. At the same time, remember, what's going to be happening is you're going to have 1,000 transactions going in the fast lane. CFIUS is going to have to pull over people from the fast lane into the slow lane and say, you got to do the full file. That could put a strain on CFIUS as to its ability to do this. There's other parts of that I'll skip. I would say that a very important issue is going to be marketing. Okay, this is not, by the way, a Treasury specialty, as you can probably tell from a long-term Treasury person, is how do you explain to critical technology companies who have never heard of CFIUS in their life that a non-controlling, so not operational control, But non-passive investment now means you have to file with CFIUS. So the way CFIUS works now, and Dave is an old practitioner of this, is it is a spread, the word is spread through the M&A law firms. Hey, you gotta go, there's a CFIUS process here. So what if you get an investment that's not controlled, there's no merger, there's no acquisition, it's just an investment. There may not be an M&A lawyer involved. And so how do you basically make sure that companies who are in the critical technology field, whatever that means, which have to be defined, are knowledgeable enough to basically say, oh, we're supposed to be filing with this thing that sounds like a venereal disease. And so, and that is the area that I think could be a bit more of a problem, because I remember during the process over whether or not joint ventures should be in the export control field or should be in CFIUS, and one of the people from the DIUX report was saying, well, nobody in Silicon Valley really knows much about the export controls. And my question was, and they know something about CFIUS? And the answer is like, they know nothing about CFIUS. So I see that as a challenge to Treasury and the government that they probably haven't started addressing yet. Anyway, I'll stop there.
Great, thanks Clay, and thank you Dave for the introduction, and a shout out to the organization overall, and thank you Ken for inviting me to participate. So I always think it's really important for any conversation about CFIUS to start with, what is foreign direct investment anyway, and why do we care, right? Always start with the why you care piece. So our organization, which was founded in 1990, is the only association that exclusively represents international companies in the United States. We are now 211 strong, so while we're still pretty small, we're definitely growing. I think international companies right now overall feel a little bit of the spotlight on them. Anything using sort of the F word foreign is not thought of too favorably right now. And our members include such fantastic companies like Japan-based Toyota, Korea-based Samsung, German-based Siemens, and Swiss-based Nestle. All of these companies all together create the why you need to care piece about CFIUS, because across the United States, 6.8 million Americans get a paycheck from an international company, right? So let that sink in. So if it was an industry in and of itself, it would be a decent sized one, right? So over the last 5 years, 54% of all manufacturing new jobs were at international companies. So if there's going to be any, resurgence of U.S. manufacturing, it's going to be courtesy of international companies coming to the United States. And this also is a counterintuitive fact that the Americans working at these companies produce about 25% of U.S. exports. So not only are they here to serve the U.S. market, the U.S. is also a part of a global supply chain that also serves consumers outside the United States. So these companies are important. They deliver not just capital, but they also do a lot in their communities. They are also leaders in corporate sustainability, workforce development, importing practices from their global parent company. So German companies, Swiss companies do a lot of apprenticeship programs. But here's the catch. About 80 to 85% of foreign direct investment comes through M&A. And that's true in any developed country, right? The way you enter a market is to acquire, i.e. invest in, an existing operation and then work with it to succeed. And there are a lot of great stories about that. And the vast majority of foreign direct investment probably won't even touch CFIUS, right? But in terms of FIRMA, so our organization was supportive of from the get-go of revising CFIUS. So it had not been revised since Miley Cyrus was known as Hannah Montana. So it had been quite a while, right? My kids know Hannah Montana, not so much Miley Cyrus back in the day. And we believe that FIRMA will actually make the U.S. more competitive for FDI, foreign direct investment. So let me say that again. We believe that FIRMA will make the U.S. more competitive because it takes out some of the politicization by having the Congress revise law that had been needed revision due to extraordinary developments in technology, and to do so in a way that focused on national security, which is not something that's done necessarily every day now anymore, right? That FIRMA was squarely focused on national security rather than a tool for protectionism. Because all of us in the trade space know that national security right now is sort of being bandied about for a variety of protectionist policies. And we believe that the very thoughtful consideration and the bipartisan support that FIRMA ended up receiving it was going to be very, very helpful. I think that if you search the word partisan, you get like 32 million hits. Bipartisan, you get probably double digits, maybe, right? So it is no small feat that the Congress worked with the administration to end up with something that revises the process, focused on national security, and is not going to be used, hopefully, as a protectionist tool. Now, the regulatory process is going to be really important. Our organization is going to be very engaged in that. Again, starting with what I talked about at the beginning is the why you need to care piece, right? And that is critical. So ensuring that the administration implements FIRMA in a way that leaves the U.S. open for foreign direct investment, because it makes the U.S. more resilient. It puts foreign companies and foreign countries on the same side of the economic ledger as the United States, and it is an enormous boost to the U.S. workforce. I think I'll probably stop there, but I do always think that it's important. So if I didn't make clear, we absolutely supported FIRMA. We look forward to working with the administration on the implementation of the regs, and I'll just leave it there.
Thanks very much, Dave. Thank you for your kind words, and thanks to Ken for putting this panel together. It's a pleasure to be here with Clay and Nancy, who I've known for a long time. And I want to build on what Clay started with and what Nancy just focused on, and to zoom out a little bit and do a little retrospective on what's been accomplished here. This could easily have been a big disaster. If you think about what's going on in the trade and investment field right now, what we're dealing with on Section 232 tariffs, unilateral tariffs imposed in the name at least of national security, an ever-escalating trade war with China, battles with most of our major trading partners. The prospect of Congress doing a fundamental revamp of both foreign investment and export control law in that kind of an environment, would have scared most people away, having them run for the hills. Please don't let Congress do this. It easily could have gone down the road of defining economic security as national security and vastly expanding CFIUS into looking at all kinds of transactions that have no national security implications. That didn't happen. And why didn't it happen? Well, the untold story, I think, is that the congressional process of regular order worked. This is a very complex topic, and a lot of credit has to go to the chairs and ranking members of the two committees of jurisdiction, Senator Crapo and Senator Brown in the Senate Banking Committee, and Mr. Henserling and Ms. Waters in the House Financial Services Committee. They recognized early on that this was an issue that easily could have become demagogue and could have gotten out of control. And instead they said, we're going to do something old-fashioned. We're going to assert our jurisdiction as the committee. We're going to hold hearings, lots of hearings, including the one that Clay had to testify. I testified at one. Dave, I think, was going to testify, or did you testify?
I did. It was not very memorable.
You did testify. Nancy appeared. I mean, they took into account the views of many people. And that process worked, and it produced a bipartisan result, not only on a fundamental reform of CFIUS, but also on the first modernization to export control laws in decades. And that's really a remarkable achievement. And I think it's something that when I saw Heath this morning, I congratulated him and said, it's not often in one's tenure in government that you see an achievement like this, and it's one to mark your career by. And I think a lot of credit goes to people like Heath Tarbert, Rich Ashew, who's the Assistant Secretary of Commerce, who led this on the export control side, and particularly to the members of Congress who I mentioned. And let's think for a minute about what the alternative could have been. Within days of when the House passed the bill, I think it was 400 to 2, if I remember correctly, remember what was going on at the time. There was a lot of talk that the president was about to use IEPA, the authorities of the International Emergency Economic Powers Act, to put broad blanket restrictions on Chinese investment in the United States. And there's every indication that that was going to happen. And instead what happened was Senator Crapo and, to his credit, Senator Cornyn went to the White House to talk to the president, and they said, we have this bill, we think this is a better way to address these issues. It happened to pass the House by this massive bipartisan majority. And I think the fact that the Congress did its job and did it well played a big role in avoiding something that would have been much more sweeping, much more unilateral, much more damaging to the U.S. and global economies. So this is a big deal. Now I should also mention Chairman Royce and Chairman Engel, who saw an opportunity because of the way the debate evolved to do something also very remarkable that you're going to talk about a little bit later this morning, which is the first modernization of export controls in decades. And they deserve a lot of credit, and how did that come about? And I want to talk about that next. There's one part of the Washington environment that eventually did a good job, but frankly dropped the ball early on, and that's the business community. The business community early in this debate, frankly, was somewhat reluctant to speak out. Most of the major trade associations couldn't seem to get consensus on a position. They were worried about appearing to be against a CFIUS review at a time when China is not very popular in Washington. And that's why some of us had to speak out, including the four of us up here, and say, wait a minute, we've had some experience with this, and we think there's some concerns about the way this debate is evolving. And Dave referred to one aspect of that, something I was very vocal on, and that was this idea that CFIUS was going to review not just inbound investment into the United States, but outward investment, outward joint ventures when a U.S. company does a joint venture outside the United States. The argument being that involves tech transfer, and therefore CFIUS has to look at it. That did not ultimately happen, but it was probably the most controversial part of the bill. I and others spoke out against it. Why? The main reason is because, for me at least, is I had done export control work when I served in government and had also worked on CFIUS when I was in government. And what I was concerned about is the idea that CFIUS would translate its mission into looking at outbound investment. The untold story there was that was going to be 100% unilateral. The idea was, well, we're not going to let a U.S. company transfer technology to country X. We're going to have CFIUS stop it. And there was no talk at all about whether we would work with allies in making those controls multilateral. And this would have amounted to the largest expansion of unilateral export controls in 70 years since the end of the Second World War. That's not an exaggeration to say. That's what the provision would have meant. Because any company doing a basic IP licensing deal, doing a copyright deal with a company in Switzerland would have been subject to potential CFIUS review. And a number of us spoke up and said, this is too much. This is an overreach. And the reaction was from some quarters very negative. Oh, you're against national security. Well, not at all. In fact, what a number of us said was export controls, technology transfer controls, do need to be updated. The Obama administration did a lot of good things in export controls, but they didn't update the lists. And there were a lot of technologies that weren't controlled that should be. Artificial intelligence, quantum computing, the potential implications of blockchain, a number of technologies in the clean energy field. The question is, should these be controlled? And a number of us said they need to be looked at, but not by CFIUS. They should be looked at by the export control system that we've had since the end of the Second World War that by and large worked and helped bring the Cold War to a peaceful conclusion. And so the way that this ultimately got resolved was the Financial Services and Banking Committee said, yeah, we think CFIUS should be strengthened to look at inbound investment. We also think we need to update and modernize the export control system, and a bipartisan bill introduced by Mr. Royce and Mr. Engel was essentially attached to the bill and became law. And that was a very good outcome. There's now a lot of work to be done. You'll talk in the next panel about not just the CFIUS regs that have to be written over the next 18 months, but the new export control list that's going to be written. We're expecting an advance notice of proposed rulemaking from the Commerce Department on that as soon as this week, potentially. But the bottom line is that the process did work. It produced a compromise. It produced a bill that strengthens both CFIUS and the export control system in ways that everyone agrees needed to be done. But it avoided, at one of the most perilous times, an outcome that could have been much substantially worse, that could have been completely unilateral, that could have significantly discouraged investment in this country, and could have been the biggest expansion in unilateral export controls we've ever seen. The fact that we avoided that, I think, is a credit to the leaders in Congress who approached this in the right way, to people like Heath and Rich Ashew and others who were willing to work for a bipartisan compromise and with the administration, and to people ultimately in the business community who were willing to step up and say what they thought. So with that, I hope that's an optimistic message. It certainly restores my faith that on a very complex issue, we can still get things done on a bipartisan basis in this town in a way that is a good result for the United States. Thank you.